Hello, and welcome to this Australia-New Zealand Women's Declaration International webinar for May 2025. My name is Janet Fraser. I'm the convener of the Feminist Legal Clinic in Exile, coming to you from Gundarra, which is west of Sydney. I have Anna Kerr with me tonight and Janet from New Zealand, and we'll all be doing technical things. We have three speakers tonight, whom I'll introduce in turn. A reminder that the presentation is recorded and question time is not. When we end for question time, I'd appreciate it if women use the Q&A box for written questions so I don't lose them in the chat. If you wish to speak, please use the raise your hand icon and I will keep a running list of the order in which I see you appear. And now to introduce our excellent speakers. Lavender is a gender-critical, radical lesbian feminist living on Bundjalung land of the far north coast of New South Wales. She was born in the bush, Mundijandi country, southwest Queensland, in the last days of World War II. Her Scottish forebears valued education, so that in the late 19th century, her maternal grandmother and her four sisters all graduated from Sydney University in the very first years that women were allowed to be enrolled. There being no school bus, Lavender was sent to boarding school in a regional city before her 7th birthday. For secondary school, she went to Sydney, where her feminist headmistress was the daughter of a suffragette and goddaughter of one of the Pankhurst sisters. Her first women's liberation movement event was a rally in London's Trafalgar Square in 1969. She has been a women's liberation and lesbian activist since the 1970s in Armidale, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and the New South Wales far north coast. Her women's liberation movement work has included organising and speaking at International Women's Days, Reclaim the Nights.Conferences, being the founding mother of Lesbian Network magazine, representing lesbians at United Nations Commission for the Status of Women, supporting Aboriginal land rights, anti-discrimination work, peace, refugees, and the environment. Now, as an octogenarian radical feminist, she has retired from collective and committee work to allow space for younger women and continue to write and speak to protect women's sex-based rights. Eilean Haley is a veteran of the women's liberation movement of the 1970s, a retired public servant, a translator, Spanish to English, a poet, an aspiring novelist, and a quilter. She lives on unceded Wongal country in the inner west of Sydney. Anna Kerr is a founder and principal solicitor for Feminist Legal Clinic. As Australian country contact for Women's Declaration International, Feminist Legal Clinic is the host of these regular webinars. Anna has worked as a solicitor for over 30 years across a range of areas and now specialises in human rights law on behalf of women and girls, as well as engaging in some environmental law on the side. Anna is involved in a number of other women's organisations, including the Women's Library, Hague Mothers Group, Maternal Scholars Association, and most recently, Women's Platform for Action International, WAPI. So, those are our speakers. Thank you so much. And we're going first to Lavender, and I am going to share my screen so we can look at Lavender's beautiful slideshow.
Okay, thank you very much. Greetings, sisters from Bundjalung land. And just a little mashup to remind us where we are. So why have I chosen this topic? Well, you know, the capital cities are seen as the hub not only of mainstream but feminist politics and activism. And in regional, rural and remote areas, it's mostly invisible or disregarded by city interests. And so the term away from the city, I've deliberately chosen to highlight that some feminists and lesbians exist and are active in other places besides the cities. There's no competition. We're all there together, but sometimes we get less attention and support. So we need to overcome this political isolation. And so let's make stronger links now between regional and city. So let's start with the advantages of an out-of-city activism approach. So feminist lesbians and lesbian and feminist activists can be a bridge between other women involved in non-specific, not women's rights, but other kind of things like environment or you know, trying to get the road fixed, the local government and so on. And it's often very useful. And also, we do have the chance to get to know other activists, and sometimes, even though the groups are quite small, this is very useful. And networks then develop and can be quite, well, one of my informants told me she thinks we have very deeply formed networks and for the intensity of the regional politics. And an activist may be relatively unknown also because they've mainly been online, so that they can avoid some flack, because violence and threats from particularly males opposing not just women's interests but environmental things can often be quite a difficult thing to deal with. So there we are in 2021 when that enough marches happened right across Australia. We hung out there in Lismore, and I had the Fearless Feminist banner there. So outside the MP's office, we made quite a lot of noise, even in the rain. So the disadvantages or challenges, if you like, of activism away from the city. Now, some of these are directly related to our geographic isolation and the sparse population. But lack of transport is a very real practical thing to get to events and to network with other political women, either local or at distance. And the costs of the transport, or if you've got your own car or sharing, petrol costs. And then there's a time involved going to other towns or locations, could be 2 hours drive, could be an all-day drive. So again, I'm talking about the isolation of geographic, feminist and political, social isolation, age cohort, and cultural interests. So it's something that impinges on our activism. And so the lack of local or regional feminists as individuals and groups is a very real challenge for us. And also just a limited or no sense of what we call women's community quite commonly. And often women's community has got a vast range of women's politics, as you probably all know. But at least that kind of recognition about women having some kind of community, as loose as it may be, is positive. But it's very hard to get that here. So, and probably the Northern Rivers, we've got greater opportunities in a lot of other regions. It's also like in a city, you can go to the market or the cinema and you'll bump into women you know or feminists you've been in a collective with 20 years ago. No, we don't have those opportunities for bumping into people so much. So that's a problem. And a lot of us, I've talked with about six or seven other feminist activists around this issue just recently. And the missing of the face-to-face connection, you know, that's a really important thing. Sitting down for coffee, we read each other's non-verbal communication and the support. So we really miss that. I mean, digital's one thing, but this is an aspect we miss. And also the lack of or very few women's services like women's health and women's refuges and so on. I mean, around here in the Northern Rivers, we do have these, but they're mostly stuck in Lismore, which is sort of one part. And yeah, and it may take women quite a long time to get there. So the third section I've got is about some women's community services that do exist or events that happen. They're a bit nervous about feminists attending because they don't want the organisation to be seen as feminist, you know, i.e. undesirable. So also there's few or no public events like International Women's Day, Reclaim the Night. I mean, we're lucky actually because, yeah, we do have some here in the Northern Rivers, but you only have to go to Tenterfield or Inverell and it's just not happening. And sometimes women come all the way, you know, 5-6 hours drive when they hear that we're having events here. It's a hell of a long way. So the other thing about out and active lesbians who are seen as weird or threatening in the general community, but also in groups. And whereas less threatening, closeted and non-activist lesbians who may be known as lesbians. I probably use the word queer, but you know, those of us who are activists are seen as being threats and weird as well. And I don't mind being weird, frankly, but some people do. So the common presumptions that lesbians are part of the LGBTI queer sphere is a problem. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about the cultural environment. Having a social science, sociology background, I can't help myself. But I kind of look at the broadly three levels, starting with the deeply conservative people that are around in the general community, resistant to change. You know, they don't want to see all the terrible greenies protesting about CSG or logging, and there's a bit of an overlap here because you know the hated greenies, and so a bit like, well, women who are seen as feminists and radical feminists are kind of hated too, like these labels are used. Now there's the more moderate people who sort of have more moderate ideas about community and change, but some change is accepted, but they want it to be local and local specific, suspicious of outside, influences, unless of course it's good for business. And with the floods that we've had up here, there's been that tension there about people coming into the community to help. Oh, it's all right, but you can go now. We've had enough of you. And so that includes some women who have been in organisations. So then not so keen on changes in long-held community values. And then, of course, we've got, you know, the radicals, the progressive idealists, and of course, we've originally the hippies and Save the Forest and all that from the 70s. And now there's a lot of new age influence and various ones. And look, some of them, I agree with their politics, but there's a few wackies around, like the sovereign citizens. So it's good, though, to hear and see questioning of both public and private values and practices and aspirations, but sometimes the solutions they suggest are pretty way out. So another part about the cultural environment is, look, some of the things we're going to say also happen in the city. So I'm not saying that they're particular to us, but have a very negative bearing when there's so little support and visibility around here. So, or patchy. So reliance on digital communications and social media. So that's a positive thing in many ways, to be able to keep in touch and exchange news and strategies and so on, but it can also be problematic, and I'll mention some of that later. So the widespread ignorance of what feminism is, I mean, you know, it's often based on what's presumed to be feminist. They see a woman standing up and speaking about against a road closure, and they presume that she's feminist just because she's feisty. Well, you know, it doesn't always go. And the also thing about the proliferation of negative stereotypes. And I just had to tell you this one. There was a woman mayor well over 15 years ago, but she was supported by a lot of feminists and progressive people. But she went on public record as saying, someone asked her, well, what's it like being a woman who's prominent, you know, in community? She said, oh, well, you know, wouldn't want to be a feminist. People think feminists are all hairy-legged lesbians. I was absolutely outraged and rang her up and spoke to her. She said, oh, I was just quoting what the general feeling is. I said, oh, thanks very much for perpetuating it. So the idea also that lesbians are either butch and femme, I mean, you still hear this stuff around. Right, so what have we got? Oh, systemic lesbophobia, homophobia, sexism. Also, you know, all these things, racism, able-bodyism and ageism, they're absolutely systemic. And, you know, this is a problem that we face everywhere. We need more support, though. It's very hard to deal with because we're seen as just individuals when we speak up, a lot of us feminist activists. But examples here with when we have community crises and events like the floods or an anti-gas sit-in or something, people go, oh, look, those feminists, they're so aggressive, and those aggressive lesbians. And, you know, blokes are pretty aggressive too, and you know, and women who don't even look like feminists can be fairly assertive. And of course, a lot of people don't know the difference between assertive and aggressive. And I've just put in this little stereotype here about women football players, regardless of their sexual orientation. Presumed they're lesbians if they've got short hair. So a lot of them are sort of, even though they're not lesbians, like the Matildas, are lesbians. So there we go at a CSG rally. Yes, next one, please. Don't need to see much of me. Gender critical politics away from the city. Yeah, I know that I keep on saying this. I know that these issues do arise in the cities, but are magnified for us. There's very painful and difficult splits amongst feminists and lesbian feminists in the community, friendship groups, and even personal relationships over the whole thing of gender identity and gender critical political activism. And I know of quite a few lesbian couples who've really done it hard over that, and some of them ending up parting because they just couldn't cope with the whole issue, both the ideas and the practices. And of course, I'm just going to call them queer, LGBTIQ plus groups. Of course, they're rusted onto gender ideology and have been known to expel or be very unwelcoming to gender critical feminist lesbians. And there's terrible denigrating gossip that emanates from these groups, not just their Facebook pages, but, you know, at their once a year dance and so on. We've got a very big, prominent GLBTI social group here that has New Year's Eve dances and so on. And, you know, it's like the field of fallen lesbians who thought they could go there and not have to talk politics and just get on with having good fun. And it's been too difficult. So basically, you know, gender critical feminist lesbians have very few allies. And sometimes people say they agree with us about our politics and wanting women only space, but they are dingoes. They don't want, they're fearful of being seen as supporting gender critical. So less supported women's issues. So I just run through the little list because, you know, sex-based women's rights, women only services and space, lesbian rights, lesbian mothers' rights, women and children with a disability. And lesbians or anyone who opposes sexist speech and practices, and actually a couple of blokes do from time to time, and they're told they're wusses. So, you know, aging and ageism and aged care, they're not very popular issues and hardly get any support. And those of us who want to be called lesbian rather than queer or gay or cis and all that rubbish, it's very unpopular. Right, so we're getting on to our challenges now. Men speaking or marching at Reclaim the Night and International Women's Day. Gay men that think being gay makes them a feminist, for God's sake. I think a challenge is any man who says they're a feminist is a challenge. Women supporting men claiming any of those above. Women publicly criticising individual feminists and feminist organisations, and I can tell you it goes on a lot. And women want to dissociate themselves often too. Women with little or no feminist involvement, denigrating feminists and lesbians, even their friends, and especially about gender critical. So other challenges, male privilege, well, it's everywhere, isn't it? Oh, a great one was when I was at the Women's Health Centre a couple of months ago. So the male partner of the staff member, who wasn't actually in the building, just wandered in, past the reception area, into the staff and treatment areas. And not one of the women challenged him. And I said something to the reception, because I was a visitor, I'm no longer involved. I used to be on the management committee. I said, oh, I didn't know you allowed men in here. And they go, oh, it's all right, we know him. So, you know, that male privilege stuff. So the conflation of sexual orientation and gender identity, yeah, we know about that, but you know, it is a real challenge to try and get people to understand these are two different things. And in fact, gender identity is a load of old cods. And so gender identity politics and its mindless acceptance by the general public, LGBTI groups, and services, public and community organisations, whether they're providing a service or sporting or so on, you know, it is very difficult to deal with. And I have to add, bloody pronouns, they're a challenge. We've got to stand up to them. So challenges, more or less things for us to do. We'll have a bit more of our to-do list in a minute. Forming alliances with non-political lesbians and straight feminists, really important. Even though we see a lot of differences, personal differences, it's really important for us to try and do this. And sometimes it's quite difficult too, because of the stereotypical idea that, you know, feminists are a no-no. So dealing with social media and online groups' hostility to gender critical ideas, there's been a lot of fallouts. Now, I don't do social media, so I only hear about it. But the ideas and the individuals who are denigrated, there's very little support. I mean, that can happen with media, social media, etc. anywhere, because, you know, there's not necessarily a geographical barrier, but it is a big challenge. Now, I'd like to think one of our challenges moving forward is to find and support young and emerging activist women, many who are critical of sexism and the patriarchy, not necessarily talking about gender critical stuff, but you see them out there, IWD sometimes, and often talking very much about personal experiences, but hey, we know the personal's political, but they're reluctant to be seen or identify as feminists. And I think this is very much a widespread phenomena these days. So somehow we've got to clean up the image, have we? I don't know, clean up their ideas. And just have to put this in that it's very relevant around here, but not exclusively, that the presumption that green and environmental politics are feminist or at least pro-women, well, hello, we've seen some terrible things happen from there. So there's the IWD lunch that I organised at Lennox Head some years ago, and had a good cross-section of women, had an intergenerational, 3 different speakers, aged 30, 39, 52 and 80. Next one, please. So changes we want, I'm thinking general community, of course these are general again, respect and space for feminist voices. I mean, this has been told to me by quite a few women I've discussed this issue with, and respect and support for women-only spaces, greater understanding and support for sex-based women's rights, because when you just say women only, they don't always get it. Recognition that not all lesbians want to be part of the LGBTIQ+, or that those organisations, and often spokesmen of them, speak for all of us lesbians. It's that terrible presumption. Right, what do we want to see from feminists and lesbians, others in our camp, so to speak? Well, we want that support, whether it's in our public roles or personal lives. And as appropriate and agreed, we need to be careful we don't presume what others want, of course. And we want to see critics of gender critical activists and activism challenged publicly if possible. As I say, it's like the thing about whether someone's a feminist or not. People will come up and say to you privately, oh yeah, I'm on your side, or I know what you're talking about. But come on, speak up, have the guts. We're not acting just for ourselves individually. So another thing, of course, this goes with a lot of activism, look after our own personal health and well-being and try to minimise stress and avoid becoming worn out. It's a big one. It happens. And also something we want to see is upskilling and supporting individual feminists and lesbians in their abilities and strategies for calling out gender ideologies and as appropriate, skills like public speaking and digital and written communications. So yeah, we want more work and contact with young lesbians and young feminist women. They're out there, and somehow we need to find those links and develop also ways of educating women in general society about, I've said that before, haven't I? Gender critical reality. upskilling women to promote, and I'm sorry about the repetition, social media, webinars. These are kind of things we need to assist each other with. Thanks, Janet, for your skills. And support for dealing with the negativities of gaslighting and denigrating gossip and so on, and the conflicts that happen about gender critical politics. And well, we'd like city-based feminists to reach out and support and include us personally and politically. A long-standing friend of mine, I think 48 years I've known her, I was talking with recently, lives in the city, and I said, oh, I really want us to keep in touch a bit more. And she said, oh, I'm much too busy, I'm sorry, but I've got bushwalking and I've got book group and so on. I go, okay, right, I've been a has-been, haven't I? So that's a little message, how we can empower each other. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's all now.
Thank you very much, Lavender. That was really thought-provoking, and I relate to it as a woman who lives in the regions. So yeah, thank you very much. I look forward to discussing it further. And now I'd like to hand over to Eilean. Eilean, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Here we go, share. Okay, so my topic tonight is Get the Men Out, and it's about protests by women prisoners against the presence of men in women's jails. So thank you, Janet, for hosting this, and good evening, everybody. This is a picture of Laverne Cox playing Sophia in Orange is the New Black. Friendly, cooperative, even-tempered, an asset to the inmate community of Litchfield Penitentiary. He's the jail hairdresser, as you can see, and no trouble to anybody. Who'd want to get rid of him? This portrayal has been massively influential, I reckon, in shaping public attitudes to the subject of men who say they're women in women's prisons. I don't know about you, but most of my attempts on Facebook or whatever to talk about men in women's prisons fall on deaf ears or are met with the cyberspace equivalent of a shoulder shrug. At some point I composed this little ditty that goes to the tune of Cell Block Tango. Okay, all right, trigger warning, I'm about to sing. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And if it does, it doesn't matter. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And if it does, who are you to say it's wrong? Okay, I'm not going to sing again. Okay, you'll be happy to know. Right. So in the course of these kind of conversations, there was a bloke who said to me, it may well be that women prisoners don't normally see it as a big problem and can deal with it, just as other bullies or male guards, they turn their backs on them or bash them. Well, that was it. That started me off on a search for instances where women prisoners did see it as a big problem, as a problem big enough for them to protest or object in some way. First of all, let me clarify that what I'm dealing with here is what prisoners and former prisoners have done or said. Not human rights advocates, not prison staff or former prison staff. Splendid and important as the testimonies and work of such people have been, what I'm interested in is what women prisoners had to say and what they've done. And let me also say at this point that there is a distinct possibility, more than a distinct possibility, that women prisoners' discontent with the presence of men who say they're women is far more widespread than has been manifest in the form of overt protests. The main inhibiting factor is fear of retaliation or punishment by either the men or the prison authorities or both. And this is a well-founded fear, as we shall see. I've divided women prisoners' protests up into 4 different kinds: direct action, speaking out, lobbying, and lawsuits. So I'll start off with direct action, by which I mean women prisoners who simply do not comply with the TWA mantra, who won't accept that trans women are women, who refuse to go along with the deceit and delusion, who don't stand for the cognitive dissonance that this whole regime of gender ideology promotes, and who, what's the other term? Yeah, won't put up with gaslighting. Okay. And I'll start with a homegrown example from my own town of Sydney, Australia, which is a former penal colony, just by the way, Sydney. Yep. Now, in 2019, women prisoners at the Mary Wade Women's Correctional Centre got into fights with Evie Amati, a man who says he's a lesbian, who went on an axe rampage after he tried to date a lesbian and she fled from him. One such fight, at least at the Mary Wade, was occasioned by a woman telling Amati he should be in a male prison. Then we have the case of Janie Southerly, a prisoner at HMP Greenock in Scotland. Miss Southerly used the pronouns he and him of a fellow prisoner, a man who says he's a woman, and referred to the man as a tranny. He accused her of transphobic harassment over a 4-year period, 2019 to 2023, and she faced a criminal trial. That's a criminal trial, not a civil trial, okay? Now, the trial resulted in a not proven verdict earlier this month, but meanwhile, while the process was in train, Ms. Southerly came up for what should have been an opportunity to move to an open unit. Some reports describe this as parole, but due to the criminal action against her, she lost that opportunity and spent more than 2 additional years in jail. So note the punishment Ms. Southerly endured for objecting from both the man and the prison authorities and Scotland's prosecution service. Jamie Alley, who is a prisoner at Shakopee Prison in Minnesota, USA, provides an example of a different kind of direct action by women prisoners, the boycott. She has withdrawn, she told Alpha News this month, from every single one of my classes because there are transgenders in them and it's very traumatic. That's her direct words. Another boycott example from Canada. In Canada, the women's prison system provides group-based psychological programs designed to heal childhood sexual trauma. However, these programs are open to male inmates who say they're women, including those with convictions for sexual offences or violent offences involving women and children. The human rights organisation CAUSEBAR reports that women prisoners avoid these programs if such men are present in the groups. Note that such programs are supposed to facilitate rehabilitation, and accordingly, the presence of the men is undermining a prime objective of the whole correction system, as well as depriving the women themselves of a beneficial experience. And this might be a good place for a pause to note that most women prisoners, in fact, the overwhelming majority of women prisoners everywhere, have been the victims of male physical and/or sexual violence prior to entering prison, often during their childhood or adolescence. In addition, poverty, neglect, drugs, mental health issues, a childhood in the care system, self-harm and suicide attempts are all common components of women's prisoners' life stories. And so we can say that the female prisoner population, accordingly, is a highly traumatised population. So at this point, we could go on to the second form of protest or objection that I've identified, which is what I've called speaking out. That is, providing oral or written testimonies from within prisons. This form of protest depends for its efficacy upon collaboration with outside advocates who've got the wherewithal to publish the testimonies and or read them out publicly at protests. This is an example from Canada. Letters smuggled out of prisons by women's rights advocates in 2021-2022 and published on the website Gender Dissent. And this is an example from the USA, a protest at the state capitol in New Jersey in 2023, at which testimonies were read out from prisoners in the state's women's prison. The cops are there to keep at bay the usual group of baying trans extremists. Okay. Prisoners have also given oral testimony through phone calls to people outside, which, if they're recorded, can then be made into podcasts, or otherwise they're quoted in written articles, for example, by the pro-woman media platform Redux. The speaking out process requires a good deal of trust on the part of prisoners. They will mostly want or need to use an alias or remain anonymous. In some cases, they don't even want to reveal what prison they're in. The fear of retaliation or punishment looms large here. The speaking out process is often facilitated by former prisoners who've maintained friendships and sisterly solidarity with women inside. This is one such woman, Amy Ichikawa, who was imprisoned in California. Others include Rebecca Wombo, Minnesota, USA, and Heather Mason of Canada. Now, we'll go on to the third kind of process, lobbying. By lobbying, I mean putting the case before legislators, government officials, or other influential bodies. I'll start again with an Australian example. In 2022, prisoners at the Dame Phyllis Frost Centre, Melbourne, sent a petition to the Victorian Minister for Corrections, Corrections Victoria, and the Ombudsman, asking for the removal of a man who says he's a woman called Lisa Jones. The prisoners were concerned for their safety, they said, as Jones has a working penis and a history of violent sexual assault. And they said that they were initially told the inmate, that is Lisa Jones, would be locked down 23 hours a day, but that ultimately administration aimed for a full living, working and socialisation integration. The petition did not succeed. The man remained at the Dame Phyllis Frost and further men were later sent there. Canada provides an interesting example of lobbying in that the lobbying effort was directed towards a mainstream, well-heeled prisoner advocacy outfit rather than towards pollies or bureaucrats. In 2021, 22 former prisoners signed an open letter to the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, CAEFS, which is, of course, named after the renowned 19th century prison reformer. I thought it might be nice to put a picture of her into this, okay, because she's large, she's widely accredited with the idea of single spaces for women in prisons. Yeah, okay. And now the CAEFS makes all the right noises in terms of women's rights and so on, but the former prisoners who signed that open letter accused CAEFS of having repeatedly silenced criminalised women's reports, questions and input when they challenged CAEFS's transgender position, a position that was decided on, so the signatories say, by a large majority of women without experiences of criminalisation. And in that open letter from 2021, the signatories urged CAEFS to join a call for an investigation into the issue of men in women's prisons. As far as I know, CAEFS has yet to do anything of the kind, and I don't think that they will be doing anything of that kind anytime soon. CAEFS receives funding from two government departments, Public Safety Canada and Women and Gender Equity Canada, and given the official situation in Trinidad, as it's commonly known, CAEFS would presumably be risking their government funding if they did anything that looked even remotely against gender ideology. And they'd lose their government funding, and of course they wouldn't want to do that. So onwards now to the fourth kind of protest, lawsuits. The action by women at the FMC Carswell, Fort Worth, Texas, USA, has got to be one of the first, if not the first, lawsuit ever filed by prisoners against the presence of men who say they're women in a women's jail. It dates from 2016. This is Rhonda Fleming, one of the plaintiffs in that case. She and two other prisoners filed a motion in December 2016 seeking to have FMC Carswell included in a temporary injunction issued earlier by a district judge that blocked the Obama administration, which was then in its final days, from enforcing a directive which allowed public school students to choose a bathroom based on gender identity. They followed this up in February 2017 with a suit against the Bureau of Prisons for allowing men who say they're women to be placed in female prisons. They named Obama, the Democratic National Committee, and several former Obama cabinet members as respondents. The case was dismissed. Rhonda Fleming has brought or sought to bring a number of other suits since then, the most recent being one against the Tallahassee FCI in Florida, in which she argued violation of her constitutional right to bodily privacy. That's Amendment 4 of the US Constitution. The case went to trial in Tallahassee in January 2025. It was the first case to do so, and this was seen as something of a victory, but it too was lost. And just to pause here to say I'm unaware of any lawsuit challenging the presence of men in women's prisons that has been won. If anybody hears of any, please let me know. Meanwhile, male prisoners who were denied allocation to the women's estate have been winning lawsuits against prison authorities. I haven't quantified this phenomenon, but one recent case was here in New South Wales when Melissa Yarnold reached a confidential settlement with New South Wales Corrective Services and Police late last year. But back to actions by women's prisoners. In California, prisoner Tomiyekia Johnson, that's her in the pig, and 5 others are bringing a case against the Secretary of the Californian Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. The case seeks the overturn of a Californian state law, SB 132, which facilitates the housing of men who say they're women in the women's estate. The suit claims the law violates the 1st, 8th and 14th Amendments to the US Constitution. The case has been ongoing since 2021, so it's been ongoing for 4 years at this time without getting anywhere near reaching a resolution. One reason for that it's taken so long and got nowhere, is the persistent opposition to it mounted by the very prestigious ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU petitioned the court to be added as party to the case, so in representation of men who say they're women who want to continue to be allowed to be put in women's jails. And the ACLU is now seeking to have the case dismissed altogether. Now, however good the ACLU might be on other issues, and I would agree that they are, and they have been, and they have a wonderful history, the ACLU is proving itself to, well, it's blotting its copybook. It's hardly a friend to women's prisoners, I would say. Janie Southerly, the Scottish prisoner I mentioned earlier, is now suing the prison service over its failure to provide single-sex spaces at HMP Greenock. There was a previous attempt to sue the prison service in the UK, mounted by FDJ, a former prisoner, in 2021. And we might pause here to note the anonymity the claimant resorted to in that case. The judge in that case said his job in relation to the policy of letting men who say they're women into women's jails was to decide whether the policy was lawful, not whether it was desirable. He ruled inadmissible a variety of evidence of the harms to women caused by the policy and found the policy to be lawful. The outcome for Ms. Southerly may be different, given the recent finding by the Supreme Court about the meaning of the term woman in the UK Equality Act. Also, it's been hinted that J.K. Rowling will be financing the suit through her newly set up Fighting Fund. I will end on that hopeful note. To conclude, women prisoners do not in general feel comfortable with men who say they're women in women's prisons, nor do they feel they can deal with the presence of such men with confidence and ease. There are a growing number of expressions of disquiet, objection, and rebellion. Mainstream prisoner advocacy organisations, such as CAEFS, and orthodox human rights organisations, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, have been unresponsive to this upsurge due to their allegiance to gender identity ideology. New networks are developing in the vacuum thus created. These new networks are made up of prisoners, former prisoners, and advocates for women's sex-based rights. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really fantastic. I knew about a couple of those, but I had no idea there was so much opposition to the men with rapid onset sentencing dysphoria. So thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I look forward to your update in a little while. And now I'd like to hand over to Anna. Anna, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. So my talk should probably be called Conspiracy Theories 101, since every self-respecting conspiracy theory relates to the Freemasons, from what I can tell. But anyhow, we're trying not to get too deep into that. This will be a skim. This is a very big topic. I didn't realise when I started just how large a topic it was, but I can only just go very quickly over the surface of it. But I think we need a lot more feminist analysis of Freemasonry and other secret societies and the role they play in maintaining the patriarchy. This is just a quick warning. For those of you with a weak stomach, or if you're easily offended, this probably isn't a presentation for you. I also should say that I personally have no direct experience with Freemasonry or any of the other secret societies that will be mentioned. So, you know, I'm just doing this on the basis of research that I've done. So just officially, Freemasons claim the roots of their craft are in the medieval guilds of the stonemasons from the 1700s, which used secret handshakes and symbols to identify each other and their level of training and expertise. So the apron and the square and the compass were the tools of their trade and continued to play a symbolic role in modern Freemasonry, which of course is not restricted to those trades. Freemasonry is structured into lodges, and these are governed by larger bodies called Grand Lodges, and I'm sure you've seen their buildings around the place. To all accounts, Freemasonry can boast its members have included many members of the royal family, many heads of state, key individuals within the legal fraternity, eminent scientists, famous entertainers, artists, and musicians. I had no idea until I started this research just how many of the famous people in Western history, at least, are Freemasons, or were Freemasons. Indeed, in the Western world, it would seem if a man was famous, there's a better chance than not that he was a Freemason. So in view of this, you do not really need to be a conspiracy theorist to think the world is skewed in favour of those who claim membership of the Brotherhood. Aside from the seemingly well-grounded claims of nepotism and corruption, there are, of course, even more disturbing allegations that have been levelled against Freemasonry throughout history, and we might touch on some of those a bit later. However, the public persona of Freemasonry, which we kind of see images of, is that of an increasingly antiquated group of old men holding rather dull meetings with fancy aprons, secret handshakes, and some rather bizarre and creepy rituals. They claim to be focused on self-improvement and philanthropic work, and indeed they do continue to operate a lot of charities in our communities. But if that's all they do, why is it so secretive? And here's a picture of the largest lodge celebrating its 275th anniversary. This is in England, and pictured in that is the Queen's cousin, the Prince Edward, Duke of oh God, I thought I had it written down, but anyhow, the members of the royal family are very much involved in Freemasonry. So this next slide shows just how far their influence goes, because Freemasonry is difficult to pin down and study, not only because of the secrecy, but also because there's no one centralized body. So when I'm talking about Freemasonry, really, I'm talking about it in the broadest sense, to include the many quasi-Masonic and clandestine groups, as well as the many groups and degrees recognised by Freemasonry itself. The influence of Freemasonry is dispersed through its numerous offshoots and affiliated organisations, some of which are more mainstream community groups from which they can recruit members. So you'll see Rotary, Lions Club, Boy Scouts, all of these were established by individuals who were Freemasons. Freemasonry does not claim to be a religion itself, but it does share symbolism and mythology, not only from the Bible, but also from Judaism, Islam, and Eastern religions. Further, it would seem that many more recent religions, such as Mormonism or Seventh-day Adventists and the Pentecostal movement, have been established also by individuals who are originally Freemasons, and some of them incorporate rather similar rituals and symbols. There have been times when anti-Semitism has resulted in Jewish people being excluded from Freemasonry, causing the establishment of B'nai B'rith as an adjacent group to fill the gap. However, Masonic membership is no longer limited to Protestant Christians, but can be found across all cultures, religions, and political affiliations. While Freemasons now claim to welcome members from all religious traditions, the favour is not necessarily returned. For example, there has been open hostility towards Freemasonry from the Catholic Church throughout history, and various popes have banned members from joining as Freemasons. And instead, the Catholic Church has set up its own rival secret societies, which include Opus Dei and the Order of the Knights of Columbus, who were apparently seen at Jimmy Savile's funeral in their regalia, which is quite similar to that worn by Freemasons. So together with mainstream religions, these Masonic and quasi-Masonic societies have played a significant role in creating and maintaining patriarchal interests by accumulating power and influence through the use of secrecy, deception, and subterranean violence, and by necessarily limiting the involvement of women. So as we've talked about, the Freemasons, while they might be the largest and oldest and best known group, they're only one of a menagerie of weird and wonderful clubs and societies that cater to secret men's business. And I say men's business because although it's true that there are forms of Freemasonry and affiliate groups that cater for women and girls, in Anglo-American Freemasonry, women are still in the main excluded. Their own groups may be meeting, but they usually have to have male members present, and they're not invited to the inner sanctum of the male groups. So they're sort of separated. Fundamentally, these are fraternal societies. They're designed to provide a supportive brotherhood for men. In fact, some of the women's groups, the women are obliged to still call each other brother. So by the nature, these fraternal societies require men to keep secrets from the women in their lives as much as anyone else. The preoccupation with the exclusion of women is clear from Masonic initiation rituals, which require the exposing of the candidate's breast to ensure that they are not a female. Interestingly, the United Grand Lodge of England has indicated that men who identify as trans women should be allowed to remain Freemasons if they originally joined as men, which suggests that Freemasons fundamentally understand that it's not actually possible to change sex. Turning something off. The intention to exclude women is also evident in the traditional blood-curdling oath of the Master Mason, which among other things includes vows not to aid nor be present at the initiation of a woman. They also promise various other things, including keeping each other's secrets and promising not to cheat or defraud each other, not to have illegal carnal intercourse with each other's wives, mothers, sisters, or daughters, not to strike a fellow Mason, and to help fellow Masons when they're in distress. And this is no doubt what Freemasons claim to be the personal development and moral training that they provide to their members. It's somewhat disturbing that they are not specifically bound to follow these rules in relation to the rest of humanity, but only in relation to their fellow Masons. All right. So next question is, what is the G about? So while Freemasonry does not claim to be a religion, many Masonic groups do require members to have a faith in a god or a higher being. And it's suggested that the G in their logo stands for both God or geometry or grand architect of the universe. However, there are others who suggest that the G actually stands for Gnosticism, or a secret spiritual knowledge that has the potential to save the soul while upsetting the mainstream Catholic Church. Bit of a bonus. Gnostics challenge established authority and the very existence of an objective material reality. So it's a bit like postmodernism. It values individual experience over universally accepted objective reality. And certainly Freemasonry and Gnosticism share symbols and both delight in secrecy. And Gnostics also have initiation rites and rituals where they seek to achieve altered states and release the divine spark, which they believe is trapped in the material body. Some Gnostic sects believe liberation comes through radical freedom, including breaking social and moral norms. So we can only hope that that doesn't involve sexual depravity, including raping and eating babies, as has been alleged historically by the Catholic Church, as well as more modern conspiracy theorists. Masonic initiation rites are often humorously referred to as riding the goat, although Freemasons deny the involvement of livestock. Baphomet, or the sabbatic goat, is a winged hermaphrodite, often depicted with a pair of breasts, and this symbol is associated with the Knights Templar. And so although it cannot be formally established that Freemasonry arose out of the traditions of the Knights Templar during the Crusades, there's a great deal of Masonic folklore and mythology that claims this is the case. And some of their degrees are actually called the Knights Templar degree. So ultimately, the Knights Templar were accused of heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, and homosexual practice, as well as financial corruption by King Philip IV of France, who was apparently greedy for their money, and he and the Pope went after the Knights Templar in 1307. So their leaders were arrested and burnt at the stake in a very Christian manner. So in view of this history, perhaps it is understandable that the Freemasons like to keep a low profile. I note that in some parts of Africa in the current time, people have coined the term anistocracy to refer to members of society who participate in Freemasonry and progressive and practice homosexuality in order to enrich themselves. So this suggests that Freemasonry may operate as a cover that gives men license and opportunity to engage in illicit homosexual sex, which is otherwise unacceptable to their communities. Who knows? It's difficult to be sure about any of this because even the majority of members of Freemasonry aren't let into the top level secrets. It seems the explanations provided to apprentices at the lower levels are not necessarily the full story. The rank and file Freemasons are both physically and metaphorically hoodwinked, as they are also made to wear a blindfold or a hoodwink in Masonic initiation ceremonies. And this is a picture of a traditional hoodwink on the screen. So whatever they're hiding, they certainly don't want women to know about it. The penalty that a Master Mason agrees to if he should break his oath is no less penalty than that of having my body severed in two, my bowels taken from thence and burned to ashes. But the entered apprentice, their oath merely involves no less penalty than to have my throat cut across, my ear, from ear to ear, my tongue torn out by the roots, and my body buried in the rough sands of the sea, a cabled toes length from the shore. And then for the second degree or fellow craft, there is no less penalty than to have my left breast torn open, my heart and vitals taken from thence and thrown over my left shoulder. This has all reminded me when I was reading this of found some of these manuals actually in my own grandfather's belongings. So I was able to access all these, but you can also find them online. But it reminded me of something the pirates would say in the novels of Robert Louis Stevenson. And of course, I looked up Robert Louis Stevenson, and of course, he was a Freemason. And the Jolly Roger, or the skull and crossbones, is a well-known Masonic symbol. So then I went down another rabbit hole and found a whole lot of mythology connecting the Freemasons to the pirates, but we won't get into all that today because we'll run out of time. But we might scoff at all these oaths and rituals and symbols and secret handshakes as sort of schoolboy nonsense perpetuated now by a bunch of geriatrics, except we should bear in mind the knowledge that men really can be a bloodthirsty lot and that they may be capable of these kinds of unspeakable acts. And indeed, there is some significant evidence that Jack the Ripper's grotesque mutilations of his victims were inspired by these Masonic oaths. And according to some researchers, the police and establishment conspired to cover up that this was indeed the work of a Freemason, which some claim has now been confirmed by recent DNA evidence, but we won't go further into that. What we do know is that cults have long existed that engage in mind control, financial exploitation, and sexually motivated violence. What I found eye-opening was just how many of these cults, religious or otherwise, borrow from Masonic traditions and can trace their origins to a founder who once belonged to the Masons. A surprising number of these groups refer to themselves as the family, which is rather chilling, and they work to isolate members and supplant their existing familial and social supports. Typically, it's later revealed that the charismatic leaders were engaged in financial fraud and sexually predatory behaviour, mostly at the expense of hapless women and children, who are then left psychologically harmed and impoverished if they manage to escape ritual killings. So some of the notorious examples include Manson family, the People's Temple at Jonestown, and in Australia, the Family, which was also known as the Great White Brotherhood. Anyhow, you're probably saying, what's this all got to do with trans ideology? So let's have a look at that. So Karl M. Bayer was a German-Israeli author and social worker, and he's claimed to be the first individual to undergo a female-to-male sex change operation in 1906. He wasn't technically a Freemason, but he was director of the Berlin Lodge of B'nai B'rith, which is the Jewish fraternity modelled on Freemasonry, established at a time when Jewish people were experiencing difficulty being accepted into Freemasonry due to anti-Semitism. They also accepted as a member Harry Truman, who then worked with them and others to help them establish the State of Israel after World War II. And yet Carl M. Bear provided a first-person account of being raised as a girl in his book, Memoirs of a Man's Maiden Years, which was written under the pseudonym N.O. Body. This book was very popular when published in 1907 and was twice made into a film in 1912 and 1919. Carl M. Bear, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly, but he's hailed as the first trans person to successfully have his sex changed on his birth certificate and to be granted the right to marry. Except none of this is accurate because he was not actually trans and it was not a sex change operation at all. This is because Carl M. Bear was raised as if he were a girl, but in fact he was always a boy. He was just a boy born with a disorder of sexual development. He had hypospadias. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right either. Anyhow, he shared his experiences of being raised female while he felt inside as if he was male. He shared those experiences with German physician and sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, who collaborated with him in publishing his book. Hirschfeld then was operating a medical practice in Berlin through the 1920s, which was a hub for trans people, and he was arguably the first advocate for transgender rights. Under Hitler, his sexology research institute, however, was looted, had its books burned, and he was forced into exile. But he happened to be friends with Harry Benjamin, who used to visit his research institute on a regular basis, and then went on to experiment on men's genitals back in New York. Benjamin then published what became the first textbook on transgender medicine in 1966. In 1979, he founded the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, the precursor to the present-day WPATH, and he also hosted its first conference and released the first standards of care that same year. And that was the same year, incidentally, that Janet Raymond published her prophetic book, The Transsexual Empire. There was a lot happening around that time. I also just want to note that the rainbow is a symbol that was also associated with Freemasonry, particularly the International Order of the Rainbow for Girls, which was a youth organisation established in 1922. So that long predated its use as a symbol by the gay rights movement, which was only adopted in 1978. It was adopted by artist and drag queen Gilbert Baker. So, I mean, that's a symbol that's been co-opted. Apparently even George Washington, his ritual Masonic apron also includes on it a rainbow. Anyhow, back to 1979. That was a big year for the trans movement in Australia. Australia had its first conference on transsexualism in Victoria and founded a committee on transsexualism. At this conference, Dr. Michael Ross from the new gender clinic at Flinders University in South Australia presented a paper claiming that Australia had the highest incidence of transsexualism in the world. So South Australia, where this clinic was, that's a place that has a particularly strong Masonic history, being the home to the very first Grand Lodge formed in Australia. The first Grand Master of that lodge was the Chief Justice and Lieutenant Governor of South Australia, and subsequent masters also included many governors, judges, leading members of the legal profession. So South Australian politics were widely perceived as conservative and dominated by a powerful elite of establishment families. However, in the 1970s, under the Labor Premier Don Dunstan, South Australia was transformed into a centre of progressive politics. It became the first state to decriminalise homosexuality. Then in 1976, there was sensational press coverage of the first known gender affirmation surgery performed in that state. And in 1978, that gender clinic was established at Flinders University. It was also in 1979, unfortunately, that there was a spate of brutal serial murders began. We had the murders of 2 of these 5 murders. There were 5 murders basically completed between 1979 and 1983. But aside from those murders, there were about 150 young males reported having been abducted off Adelaide streets, sexually tortured and released. Unfortunately, for 5 of these young men, they didn't get released. A group of highly connected individuals were linked to the murders, and yet somehow only one perpetrator, an accountant called Bevan von Einem, was ever convicted. Names of high-ranking members of the legal and medical profession and business world in Adelaide were linked to the murders, but they've been suppressed by the South Australian court system, earning South Australia the title of suppression state. And these crimes, the modus operandi for these crimes involved inviting them to get into a car, and typically a member of the trans community was acting as a female decoy to help lure boys into the car, because they were otherwise reluctant to get into a car that was otherwise filled with men. A number of these trans individuals have been identified, but none of them have been held accountable for their role in facilitating these crimes, which apparently implicated elite members of Adelaide society. Several of these individuals, they had a house together where the boys were taken, where they were then assaulted. Now, some of those names, those individuals are public, but they're all of them, bar one, as far as I can tell, has passed away. They all died quite young. And there's one of them, of course, and he's living in Sydney, where he continues to be active in the older gay community, which is kind of disturbing. Look, anyone who wants more details of that, it's set out in this book by Debbie Marshall, who's an investigative journalist who looked into it. Obviously, any connection between these murders and Freemasonry is conjecture. However, we do know that Adelaide had a particularly strong Masonic history. And I have a lot more information. I've got a number of more slides, but I'm going to leave it there rather than go over time. The other interesting thing is the role played by some of the elite boys' schools who seem to have a bit of a tradition of grooming boys into having relationships with members of the elite as well. I'm going to stop there because I could go on forever, and I think that will do for now. Thanks.
Goodness me, that was amazing. I don't know where you found the time to research that. I'm pretty sure you never sleep. So thank you. That was amazing. All right. I would like to thank our speakers. Thank you, Lavender. Thank you, Eilean Haley. Thank you, Anna Kerr. Fantastic presentations and so varied. That was really wonderful. I'm going to turn off our recording and then we can discuss.